On January 7th, 1945, the Ardennes forest lay shrouded in a thick blanket of snow, with drifts piling up to 3 feet high, turning the landscape into a frozen wasteland that had already claimed countless lives in the brutal winter campaign. Yet, amid this harsh backdrop, the British press tent buzzed with an almost palpable energy, a stark contrast to the grim realities outside. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery positioned himself confidently before a bank of microphones, the flashbulbs popping like distant artillery fire, casting sharp shadows across his angular, predatory features that resembled those of a hawk scanning for prey. He wore a smile that wasn't born of exhaustion or relief after enduring what many considered the bloodiest engagement on the Western Front, but rather the self-assured grin of someone utterly convinced of their intellectual superiority over everyone else present. As he began his address, he described the Battle of the Bulge as one of the most interesting and tricky operations he had ever managed, framing it not as a desperate collective struggle, but as a personal intellectual challenge he had masterfully overcome. He referred to the American forces not with the camaraderie expected among allies, but in a paternalistic tone, as if they were wayward children requiring his firm guidance to avoid catastrophe. The word "I" punctuated his sentences repeatedly, emphasizing his individual role. I employed the whole available power of the British Army in the North. I put it into the fight with a bang, and it went in with a swing. To the assembled journalists, who scribbled notes with frantic urgency, his words painted the picture of a triumphant hero stepping in to salvage a dire situation, a narrative that would soon splash across headlines and fuel national pride back home. However, some 300 miles distant at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was far from amused or impressed. Instead, he clutched a fresh transcript of Montgomery's remarks, his usually steady hands trembling with an uncharacteristic rage that simmered like a coiled spring ready to unleash. For over 3 years, Eisenhower had embodied the role of the ultimate diplomat in khaki, navigating the treacherous waters of inter-allied politics with a patience that bordered on saintly, enduring slights and barbs that would have broken lesser men, all in the name of preserving the fragile coalition against the Axis powers. He had bitten his tongue, compromised where necessary, and prioritized unity above personal ego. But on this day, the dam finally cracked under the weight of Montgomery's latest provocation. Montgomery, in his unyielding self-confidence, failed to grasp that his words weren't just boastful rhetoric. They were the equivalent of a self-inflicted wound, a professional suicide note scrawled in bold ink that would seal his fate in the High Command's eyes. The pen, as it turned out, was already gliding across paper in Eisenhower's office, drafting a response that would reshape the alliance's leadership dynamics forever. To fully comprehend why this seemingly routine press briefing morphed into a career-ending blunder for Montgomery, one must delve into the underlying fractures within the Anglo-American command structure, a partnership forged out of wartime desperation rather than genuine affinity or mutual respect. It was an uneasy marriage from the start, riddled with cultural clashes, strategic disagreements, and clashing personalities that threatened to unravel the entire effort against Nazi Germany. On one flank stood Dwight D. Eisenhower, affectionately known as Ike, a leader whose strengths lay not in flashy battlefield maneuvers, but in the subtle art of consensus building, acting as a uniformed politician who excelled at herding a diverse array of national interests toward a common goal. His approach to warfare emphasized collaboration, viewing the conflict as a massive team endeavor where every nation's contributions were vital and egos had to be subordinated to the greater good. In stark opposition was Bernard Montgomery,
or Monty, as he was widely called, the celebrated victor of El Alamein, whose tactical brilliance was matched only by his profound narcissism, a trait that often left colleagues and subordinates bewildered and frustrated in equal measure. For Montgomery, war wasn't a collective symphony, but a solo concerto, with himself as the virtuoso conductor and the American forces relegated to the role of mere accompanists, there to support his starring performance. He harbored no qualms about openly dismissing Eisenhower as a strategic novice, a well-meaning administrator better suited to handling supply chains and rear-echelon duties rather than directing combat operations, while he, the seasoned British professional, should hold the reins of true military decision-making. This simmering discord had been building for months prior to the fateful winter of 1945, with Montgomery repeatedly agitating for supreme control over all ground forces in Europe, a demand that essentially amounted to Eisenhower voluntarily stepping aside and accepting a diminished role, something that rankled American pride and ignited fierce opposition from Washington. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, ever the pragmatic statesman, frequently found himself playing the role of Monty's reluctant savior, intervening with diplomatic finesse to shield his prickly general from outright dismissal, recognizing that Montgomery's battlefield acumen was a valuable asset despite the interpersonal chaos he sowed. Eisenhower, for his part, had consistently shielded Montgomery from the full brunt of American resentment, valuing his operational expertise as a counterbalance to the headaches he caused, adhering to the unspoken agreement that the Americans supplied the overwhelming material might, tanks, planes, and manpower, while the British contributed seasoned doctrinal wisdom honed from earlier years of the war. Yet, as the bitter cold of late 1944 enveloped the continent, the power dynamics had irrevocably tilted, with the United States emerging as the dominant force, its industrial output and troop numbers dwarfing British contributions, transforming the once mentor relationship into one where the apprentice had surpassed the teacher, a shift Montgomery stubbornly refused to acknowledge or adapt to. Within the confines of his mobile tactical headquarters, a Spartan trailer that served as his command nerve center amid the snow-swept forests, Montgomery inhabited a bubble of self-assured isolation, sipping his ritualistic cups of tea while gazing at operational maps that, in his view, revealed glaring American shortcomings at every turn. He perceived General Omar Bradley's dispositions as dangerously overextended, vulnerable to exploitation, and regarded General George S. Patton's bold thrusts as little more than foolhardy risks that courted disaster rather than victory. To Montgomery's rigidly methodical mind, the prevailing chaos on the Western Front stemmed directly from Eisenhower's preference for a broad front advance, a strategy he deemed amateurish and inefficient compared to his own advocacy for concentrated, decisive strikes. Surrounded by mementos of his past triumphs, including framed portraits of defeated Axis commanders like Rommel, he convinced himself that fate itself was summoning him to assume overall leadership, to impose order on what he saw as Allied disarray. In confidential dispatches to his superiors in London,
He didn't mince words, lambasting American leadership as inept and insisting that without his steady hand, the entire enterprise risked collapse. A critique driven not by petty spite, but by an unshakable belief in his own infallibility, a conviction so absolute it blinded him to the diplomatic nuances at play. He operated under the delusion that his indispensability rendered him immune to repercussions, that the Americans' reliance on his skills would force them to endure any level of condescension or overreach, and that Eisenhower, whom he viewed as a spineless politico rather than a true warrior, lacked the resolve to challenge him directly. This hubris overlooked a fundamental truth of military hierarchy. No general
however brilliant, stands above accountability, and every soldier, from private to field marshal, ultimately serves at the pleasure of higher authority. Montgomery's failure to recognize the precariousness of his position was a critical misjudgment, one that ignored the invisible blade poised above, ready to descend at the slightest provocation. The flashpoint that ignited this long, festering tension arrived with brutal suddenness on December 16, 1944, when Adolf Hitler's forces unleashed Operation Wacht am Rhein, the massive counteroffensive better known as the Battle of the Bulge, a desperate gamble to split the Allied lines and seize Antwerp, thereby forcing a negotiated peace. German panzers and infantry surged through the thinly held American sector in the Ardennes, exploiting fog, snow, and surprise to carve a deep salient into the front, isolating units and sowing confusion across the board. This assault physically severed General Bradley's 12th Army Group headquarters in Luxembourg from his northern formations, the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies, disrupting communications and command coherence in the midst of blizzard conditions that grounded air support and hampered logistics. Faced with this dire predicament, Eisenhower demonstrated his pragmatic leadership by making a tough call. Recognizing that Bradley could no longer effectively direct operations north of the Bulge from his southern position, he decreed a temporary reassignment of those 200,000 American troops to Montgomery's 21st Army Group, ensuring unified command during the emergency. This was a decision rooted purely in military logic, aimed at streamlining responses and preventing further fragmentation, but it carried profound emotional and national implications for the Americans involved. For Bradley, the order felt like a personal affront, a de facto demotion that handed his soldiers over to a British rival he deeply mistrusted, while, for the fiery Patton, it bordered on betrayal, fueling his already simmering anti-British sentiments as he maneuvered his Third Army northward through treacherous weather to relieve the besieged bastion of Bastogne. The American generals, though seething internally, complied with disciplined professionalism, anticipating that Montgomery would handle the stewardship with restraint and respect for their established structures, acting as a temporary coordinator rather than an overlord. What they encountered instead was a display of arrogance that exacerbated every existing grievance, transforming operational necessity into a cauldron of resentment. Montgomery didn't merely assume command. He descended upon the American headquarters with the imperious demeanor of a colonial viceroy inspecting a backwater outpost, striding into the U.S. First Army's operations room without so much as acknowledging the weary staff officers who had been holding the line against overwhelming odds. He dismissed their painstakingly crafted defensive schemes out of hand, imposing his own rearrangements with curt directives, halting planned counteroffensives that he deemed premature, and addressing battle-hardened American commanders as if they were novice lieutenants fresh from West Point, their experience counting for naught in his estimation. Legend has it, he remarked upon arrival, "I shall tidy up this mess," a condescending phrase that echoed through the ranks like a slap, implying American incompetence and British superiority in a single breath. Further inflaming tensions, he declined to travel to Bradley's location for consultations, insisting instead that the American general come to him, a reversal of protocol that underscored his assumed dominance. When the meeting finally occurred, Montgomery lectured Bradley on elementary tactical principles with the patience of a schoolmaster correcting a dull pupil, while Bradley, a man of quiet dignity, suppressed his fury and maintained composure, though the strain was evident in his clenched jaw and terse responses. The Allied command atmosphere, already strained, turned outright toxic under this strain, with American officers whispering in private about whether their true enemies wore Feldgrau or khaki, debating the merits of turning their guns eastward or westward in.
Yet Montgomery remained blissfully unaware of the damage he was inflicting, interpreting the Americans' stoic obedience as validation of his methods, their silence as assent rather than restrained outrage. While he undeniably succeeded in stabilizing the northern shoulder of the Bulge, methodically reorganizing defenses and preparing for a measured counterstroke that blunted German momentum, this tactical achievement came at the cost of eroding the last vestiges of inter-allied trust, winning ground on the battlefield, but losing invaluable capital in the realm of human relations that Eisenhower prized above all. Emboldened by this perceived success, Montgomery then committed the cardinal error of publicizing his version of events in a way that amplified every slight, setting the stage for an irreversible confrontation. The January 7th press conference served as the detonator for the powder keg of accumulated frustrations, with Montgomery's words, captured in verbatim transcripts, revealing a narrative so skewed it verged on historical revisionism, tailored to burnish his reputation at the expense of his allies. He portrayed the Battle of the Bulge as a fascinating puzzle he had personally unraveled, downplaying the sheer desperation of the fight, where American GIs endured sub-zero temperatures, short supplies, and fanatical SS assaults, resulting in over 19,000 U.S. fatalities that made it the costliest American engagement of the war. Scant mention was made of the legendary stand at Bastogne by the 101st Airborne Division, where paratroopers held out against encirclement with the defiant reply, "Nuts!" to German surrender demands, or of Patton's Herculean effort to pivot his army 90 degrees and drive through blizzards to break the siege, a maneuver that exemplified American adaptability and grit. Instead, Montgomery crafted a tale of American disarray rescued by British intervention, implying that without his timely assumption of command, the front would have collapsed entirely, a storyline that flattered British audiences but ignited fury across the Atlantic. The British media, starved for uplifting stories after years of rationing and bombings, seized upon it with gusto, plastering front pages with headlines like, "Monty saves the Yanks," which only poured salt into American wounds. Upon learning of the conference, Bradley confronted Eisenhower with an ultimatum of his own, declaring he would rather resign his commission than subordinate himself to Montgomery again, while Patton, ever the blunt instrument, raged openly and demanded freedom to operate independently, threatening a full-blown mutiny in the upper echelons if the situation wasn't rectified. The U.S. command structure teetered on the brink of revolt, with officers who had shed blood in the snow feeling their sacrifices belittled and appropriated, shattering the facade of unbreakable Allied solidarity that propaganda films and newsreels had so carefully cultivated. Eisenhower, the master conciliator, recognized that further appeasement was impossible. The time for gentle nudges had passed, and decisive action was required to salvage the coalition before it fractured beyond repair. In the subdued quiet of his chef office, far removed from the front's cacophony, Eisenhower composed himself at his desk, his expression hardening into resolve as he eschewed dramatics for methodical precision. The only sound, the soft scratch of his pen on official stationery. He drafted a cable to General George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff in Washington, laying out the erosion of trust in unflinching detail, describing how Montgomery's actions and statements had rendered the current command arrangement untenable, fostering division rather than unity. Then came the bombshell. Eisenhower articulated an ultimatum, stating that if Montgomery's behavior persisted without correction, or if he wasn't removed from his position, he himself would step down as supreme commander, forcing the combined chiefs of staff to choose between him and the recalcitrant field marshal. This wasn't posturing or bluff. It was a calculated gamble backed by the weight of American preponderance, pitting the architect of the entire European theater against a single, albeit prominent, subordinate. To underscore the gravity, Eisenhower shared the draft with Montgomery's own chief of staff, Major General Francis Freddie de Guingand, a trusted intermediary who had often smoothed over past frictions. De Guingand's reaction was one of pallid shock as he absorbed the words, realizing that this document wasn't a warning, but a loaded weapon, primed to end Montgomery's career with the full backing of Allied leadership. He departed immediately, braving treacherous roads slick with ice and snow to reach Montgomery's headquarters, determined to avert disaster before the cable was transmitted, devoid of the usual bravado and instead laced with contrition, marking a humiliating capitulation for a man accustomed to dictating terms. "Dear Ike," it began, expressing regret that his previous communications might have caused distress, affirming his role as your very devoted subordinate, and pledging unwavering compliance with any directives. Signed, your very devoted servant, Monty. It represented the nadir of his wartime experience, a groveling plea to retain his position that stripped away layers of pride. Eisenhower perused it without triumph, his response measured and professional, accepting the apology, but maintaining a frosty detachment that signaled the end of any warmth between them. The immediate crisis dissipated, with public announcements reassuring the world of Allied harmony, but the underlying rapport was irreparably severed, reduced to transactional interactions devoid of trust. In the war's closing acts, Eisenhower pivoted toward favoring American commanders like Bradley, entrusting them with pivotal operations such as the Rhine crossings, where U.S. forces claimed the lion's share of accolades, while Montgomery's meticulously planned assaults, though competent, played secondary roles in the strategic tapestry. This shut up or get out episode not only preserved the alliance, but also symbolized the definitive transfer of global leadership from a waning British Empire to an ascendant United States, a transition Churchill acknowledged in private with rueful candor, confiding to aides that Montgomery's folly had nearly derailed the entire endeavor. In the annals of history, the two leaders appeared united in victory parades and photographs, but behind closed doors, Montgomery found himself marginalized, his input tolerated, but no longer influential, a hero to his nation's populace, yet a cautionary tale among the high command of how unchecked ego could undermine even the greatest talents. He retained his rank and decorations, but his authority was curtailed, his voice muted in the councils that shaped the endgame. While popular memory of the Battle of the Bulge evokes images of armored clashes and heroic stands amid the snow, the most pivotal confrontation unfolded not with bullets, but with ink and resolve in a heated office, where Eisenhower's triumph over Montgomery was one of temperament prevailing over vanity. It serves as an enduring lesson that in the crucible of total war, tactical prowess alone suffices not. Respect for comrades in arms, humility in leadership, and recognition of the mission's primacy over personal glory are indispensable. Montgomery learned too late that no individual, regardless of renown, eclipses the collective cause, and Eisenhower's firm stand ensured that the alliance endured, propelled not by artillery, but by the unyielding force of principled command. The aftermath of that January crisis rippled far beyond the immediate command tents and headquarters trailers, embedding itself into the final months of the war in Europe and shaping how victory would be pursued and remembered. With the personal trust between Eisenhower and Montgomery fractured beyond repair, the Supreme Commander no longer felt compelled to balance every major operation between British and American forces, as he had done earlier in the campaign. The broad front strategy remained in place, but the emphasis shifted unmistakably toward American Army groups, particularly Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group, which now received priority in supplies, air support, and strategic objectives. Montgomery's 21st Army Group, while still formidable and entrusted with the vital northern flank, guarding against any renewed German thrust toward Antwerp, found its role increasingly circumscribed to holding and clearing operations rather than spearheading the decisive advance into the Reich. This subtle but deliberate reorientation was Eisenhower's quiet way of ensuring that the men who had borne the heaviest casualties in the Ardennes would also reap the greatest share of the glory in the war's concluding chapter, a recompense for the indignities they had suffered in silence. As winter gave way to the tentative thaw of early spring 1945, planning intensified for the crossing of the Rhine, the last great natural barrier shielding Germany's industrial heartland. For months, Montgomery had meticulously prepared Operation Plunder, an elaborate set-piece assault involving the largest airborne drop since Normandy, massive artillery barrages, engineered bridges, and amphibious forces, all hallmarks of his preference for overwhelming force and meticulous preparation before committing troops. He envisioned this as his grand finale, a textbook demonstration of British military art that would carry his army group across the river in triumph and position it to drive straight to Berlin, reclaiming the initiative and restoring British prestige in the eyes of the world.
As winter gave way to the tentative thaw of early spring 1945, planning intensified for the crossing of the Rhine, the last great natural barrier shielding Germany's industrial heartland. For months, Montgomery had meticulously prepared Operation Plunder, an elaborate set-piece assault involving the largest airborne drop since Normandy, massive artillery barrages, engineered bridges, and amphibious forces, all hallmarks of his preference for overwhelming force and meticulous preparation before committing troops. He envisioned this as his grand finale, a textbook demonstration of British military art that would carry his army group across the river in triumph and position it to drive straight to Berlin, reclaiming the initiative and restoring British prestige in the eyes of the world. Staff officers in his headquarters spoke openly of the operation as the crowning achievement of the campaign, with Montgomery himself radiating confidence that Plunder would eclipse even El Alamein in historical significance. Yet events on the ground overtook the careful script. On March 7, 1945, elements of the U.S. First Army under Courtney Hodges stumbled upon the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen still intact, a miraculous oversight by the retreating Germans who failed to demolish it in time. American troops dashed across under fire, establishing a bridgehead on the eastern bank days before Montgomery's scheduled assault. Eisenhower immediately seized the opportunity, pouring reinforcements into the Remagen lodgment and ordering Hodges and Patton to exploit the breakthrough aggressively. The bridge, though damaged and eventually collapsing under strain, allowed the Americans to surge across the Rhine in strength, turning what could have been a protracted siege into a rapid penetration. News of the capture electrified Allied headquarters and dominated headlines, with American soldiers once again proving their audacity and improvisational skill in the face of rigid enemy defenses. Montgomery, informed of the development while finalizing Plunder, reacted with barely concealed frustration. He argued strenuously that the Remagen bridgehead was too narrow and vulnerable, that resources should still be concentrated on his own meticulously planned crossing further north, where the terrain favored a broader advance. But Eisenhower, supported by Bradley and the American chiefs, overruled him. The Supreme Commander directed that the main effort would now support the U.S. bridgeheads, expanding them into a flood that would carry Allied armies deep into Germany. Operation Plunder proceeded as scheduled on March 23rd to 24th, executed with the precision Montgomery demanded. Thousands of airborne troops landing, massive smoke screens, and engineered ferries shuttling men and machines across under the cover of one of the war's heaviest bombardments. It was a technical triumph, flawlessly carried out, yet it unfolded in the shadow of Remagen. By the time Montgomery's forces stepped onto the eastern bank, American units were already miles ahead, racing eastward and encircling the Ruhr pocket, the industrial core that had sustained the German war machine. The disparity in momentum and recognition stung deeply within the British ranks. Montgomery's crossing, though larger in scale and involving Commonwealth troops from Canada, Poland, and elsewhere, received far less fanfare than the dramatic American seizure at Remagen. Newspapers and newsreels focused on the daring GIs who had beaten the odds, while plunder was portrayed as a supporting operation, solid but secondary. Montgomery issued congratulatory messages and maintained public decorum, yet privately he fumed at what he saw as Eisenhower's favoritism and strategic short-sightedness. He continued to press for permission to launch a single thrust toward Berlin with his army group reinforced by American formations, believing a concentrated blow under his command could end the war swiftly and decisively. Eisenhower, however, remained committed to the broad advance, determined to prevent any repetition of the supply crises that had plagued earlier narrow thrusts, and wary of granting Montgomery the political capital a race to the German capital would confer. As April unfolded and German resistance crumbled, the diverging paths of the two commanders became ever more apparent. Patton's Third Army dashed southeast toward Austria and Czechoslovakia. Bradley's forces enveloped the Ruhr, trapping an entire German army group, while Hodges and Simpson drove toward the Elbe. Montgomery, tasked with clearing the northern coast and advancing toward Denmark, liberated Bremen and pushed toward Lübeck, important objective. His troops performed admirably, accepting the surrender of hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers fleeing the Red Army, yet the route to Berlin lay far to the south that prevented German forces from establishing a rumored northern redoubt
Firmly in the American sector. When Eisenhower halted the Western Allies at the Elbe on April 12th to await Soviet forces as agreed at Yalta, Montgomery's dream of leading the final charge into the enemy capital evaporated entirely. The war in Europe ended on May 8th with German capitulation, and while Montgomery stood prominently in victory photographs alongside Eisenhower, Bradley, and other leaders, the narrative of the final campaign had unmistakably become an American one. In the post-war years, the events of January 1945 and their consequences colored how both men were perceived and how they recounted their roles. Montgomery returned to Britain a national hero, feted with honors and titles, his victories at El Alamein and Normandy etched firmly in public memory. Yet among professional soldiers and historians familiar with the inner workings of SHAEF, his reputation carried a lingering asterisk. The brilliant tactician, whose interpersonal failings nearly cost him his command and diminished British influence at the critical moment. He wrote memoirs that defended his actions vigorously, portraying the press conference as misunderstood and Eisenhower's strategy as wasteful. But the private correspondence and declassified documents told a different story. A general who misread the shifting balance of power and paid for it with marginalization in the war's climax. Eisenhower, by contrast, emerged not only as the architect of victory, but as the indispensable leader who held the alliance together through sheer force of character. His decision to draw a line in January, offering his own resignation if necessary, proved pivotal, demonstrating to London and Washington alike that American dominance in the coalition was no longer negotiable. It preserved unity when division could have prolonged the war disastrously, and it ensured that the United States, having shouldered the greatest burden in blood and treasure, would guide the final advance and shape the post-war order. The quiet ultimatum drafted in that warm office became one of the war's most decisive maneuvers, not fought with divisions or corps, but with resolve and restraint. The story of Montgomery and Eisenhower in the winter of 1944-45
ultimately transcends the personalities involved. It illuminates the fragile nature of coalitions, where military genius must be tempered by political wisdom, and where victory depends as much on managing allies as defeating enemies. Montgomery's tactical gifts were undeniable. He stabilized the Bulge's northern shoulder, orchestrated flawless set-piece battles, and contributed mightily to final victory. Yet his inability to see beyond his own convictions, to acknowledge the pride and sacrifice of the American soldiers fighting beside him, nearly unraveled everything. Eisenhower, less flashy on the battlefield, proved greater in the broader theater of war precisely because he understood that leadership in a multinational alliance required subordinating ego to mission, pride to partnership. In the end, the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes witnessed not only a desperate German offensive, but a profound test of Allied leadership, one passed not through brilliance alone, but through the quiet strength to say, when necessary, enough. The legacy of that near-catastrophic rift in January 1945 extended well into the post-war era, influencing not only the immediate conduct of the European campaign, but also the way the Second World War would be narrated, commemorated, and interpreted for generations. In Britain, Montgomery remained an untouchable icon, the beret-wearing desert fox who had turned the tide at El Alamein and then marched triumphantly from Normandy to the Baltic. Parades, knighthoods, and eventual elevation to Viscount Montgomery of Alamein cemented his status as one of the nation's greatest captains. Schoolchildren learned of his victories, newspapers serialized his memoirs, and his name became synonymous with British martial prowess in an age when the empire was quietly contracting. Yet within the corridors of power, and among those who had served at the highest levels, a more nuanced and sometimes critical view persisted. Senior British officers who had witnessed the events firsthand, including some of Montgomery's own staff, privately acknowledged that his behavior during the Bulge crisis had come perilously close to fracturing the alliance at its most vulnerable moment. Even Churchill, who had repeatedly shielded him, confided to close aides that Montgomery's press conference had been a grave error that forced uncomfortable concessions and accelerated the transfer of strategic initiative to the Americans. Across the Atlantic, the American historical narrative embraced a different emphasis. Eisenhower emerged as the steady, selfless architect of coalition victory, the man whose diplomatic skill and quiet resolve had prevented internal discord from handing Hitler a reprieve.